The morning my three children sat across the table and told me they expected their inheritance while I was still alive, I looked at each of their faces and understood something I had refused to understand for years. They had not come to see me. They had come to collect. I was 74 years old, sitting in the living room of my own home, being asked to distribute what I had spent a lifetime accumulating so they would not have to wait. I listened to every word without interrupting, and I decided in that room on that morning that what I would distribute would be nothing at all like what they expected. But to understand what I decided and why, you need to understand who I was before that morning and what I had actually built. You need to understand what the word inheritance means to a man who came from nothing and built everything through 4 decades of deliberate work. You also need to understand what it sounds like when someone you love refers to you as a burden. Not angrily, not cruelly, casually. The way you refer to a piece of furniture that has outlived its usefulness. That word, spoken by my eldest son in my own house on a Tuesday morning, is the reason I made the phone calls I made the very next day. Everything that followed was the direct result of that one word. If this story is resonating with you, I want to ask something before we continue. Subscribe to this channel if you have not already done so. Leave a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from. These stories reach people who have sat in the same chair, heard the same words, and wondered whether they had the right to defend themselves. You do. This community understands that. Now let me tell you who I am and what I built, and how I chose to end this chapter in a way that none of my children saw coming, even while it was happening right in front of them. My name is George. I am 74 years old. I spent my career in commercial real estate, working as an independent agent and eventually as a property developer. I started with nothing. My father was a laborer. My mother cleaned offices at night. I studied on weekends while working full-time during the week, and by the time I was 35, I had closed my first independent development deal. I was not born into opportunity. I built it from the floor up, one transaction at a time, across nearly 4 decades. My wife Elena and I had 3 children together. Richard, my eldest, then Paul, then my daughter Sandra. Elena died 4 years ago. That was when the real changes began. Elena had always been the interpreter between me and my children. She softened my directness, translated my silences, and kept the relationships from drying out during the years when work consumed me entirely. After she died, I found myself alone with 3 adult children who did not quite know how to speak to me without her in the room. Richard handled it by becoming controlling, calling my accountant without my knowledge, and asking questions about my portfolio. Paul handled it by withdrawing. Sandra handled it by appearing more frequently but saying less and observing more carefully. I told myself this was all grief taking different shapes. What I was actually being was generous with an interpretation that did not hold. What I had built across those 4 decades was not a simple inheritance. It was a portfolio that included 3 commercial properties, 2 residential developments still generating rental income, a private pension fund, and a collection of artworks Elena and I had acquired together over 30 years. I had never discussed the specifics with my children in detail. They knew I had money. They did not know exactly how much or in what form. The total value would have made each of them wealthy without either of them having worked for a single dollar of it. That was precisely the problem. They had never worked for it, and so they did not understand what it represented, or what it had cost me. Each property had a story attached to it. The building on Callahan Street I acquired during a market downturn in my late 30s, when I was the only buyer willing to take the risk. The commercial space on Vieira Avenue had been derelict when I first walked through it with Elena, and she had told me she could see what it would become. She was always better at seeing what was not yet there. The residential project on the hill with the red roof tiles that became a neighborhood landmark was the one that finally gave us financial breathing room after years of building on the edge of overextension. Every piece had cost me something real: time, sleep, risk, uncertainty. These were not abstract figures. They were years of my life. Elena and I had discussed the estate many times over the years. Our will was clear and fair, dividing assets equally among the 3 children, after both of us were gone. I had always assumed this arrangement was understood and accepted. What I did not understand was that my children had begun, after Elena died, to view the timeline of that inheritance not as something that would come when the time came, but as something being unreasonably delayed. I was healthy. I was active. I was still managing my own business. In their eyes, every year I remained alive and functional was a year they were being kept waiting by a father who was no longer serving any other useful purpose in their lives. The first sign came when Richard asked about the Callahan Street property. He said he was considering a business expansion and wondered if I might transfer the deed as an early inheritance arrangement. I said I would think about it, which I did not mean in the way he hoped. I was watching the way he asked. There was no gratitude in it, no relationship in the asking. It was the question a person asks when they believe the thing they want is already theirs, and someone is simply holding it for them. I told him the following week I was not in a position to make that transfer. He nodded and said nothing. But something shifted in the way he spoke to me after that conversation. Paul took a different approach. He began joining Richard on calls to my accountant under the pretense of learning about the family finances. My accountant, who had worked with me for 20 years, called privately to ask whether I had authorized this access. I had not. I called Paul and told him directly that my financial affairs were private unless I chose to share them. He said he was only trying to understand his future. I told him his future was his business and mine was mine, and that the two were not yet the same thing. He went quiet on the call and then said carefully that I should think about what happened to estates that were not properly planned. I understood the implication completely. Sandra arrived in October for what she described as a short visit. She stayed for 11 days. She spent much of that time going through drawers and shelves on the pretext of helping me organize. She found Elena's jewelry box in the bedroom closet and brought it to the kitchen table one morning, asking if I had thought about where these pieces would go. I said I had a will and everything was addressed. She asked if she could take a few pieces now, just to keep them safe. I said no. She put the box back. The following morning it was on the kitchen counter again, open, with 3 pieces missing. When I asked about it, she said she had thought I would not mind since they had belonged to her mother. The word that changed everything was spoken by Richard on a Tuesday morning in November. He had come with Paul, which should have told me something. The two of them sat across from me with the careful posture of people who have rehearsed a conversation. Richard said they had discussed it and felt it was time to address the estate while I was still healthy and capable. He said waiting was not practical. He said managing the assets was becoming complicated for someone my age. And then, lowering his voice to make it sound kinder, he said that carrying all of this alone was a burden I did not need to bear any longer. He was telling me I was the burden. He thought he was being subtle. He was not. Sandra joined by telephone during that same meeting. She agreed with her brothers. She said she wanted what was best for me. She said the stress of managing the portfolio was clearly affecting my quality of life. I had not said I was stressed. I had not said my quality of life was poor. I had not said anything yet, because I was letting them finish. What she described as concern was inventory assessment. They wanted to know what was there, which pieces were most liquid, and what the most efficient distribution arrangement would look like. They had, at some point I could not precisely identify, stopped being my children in that room and become interested parties in an estate that had not yet been settled. After they left, I sat in the living room for a long time. Elena's chair was still near the window where she had always kept it. I had not moved it since she died. I looked at it and thought about what she would have said about that meeting. She would have seen it before I did. She always saw the shapes of things before they fully formed. I then picked up my telephone, not with anger, not with intention to punish anyone, but with absolute clarity about what I was going to do and why. I called my lawyer first. Then I called the director of a charitable foundation I had supported for many years. Then I called a financial advisor I trusted more than I trusted my own sons. My lawyer, Margaret, confirmed what I had suspected. The approach my children were taking had a name, and it was not unusual. She had seen variations of it many times. When adult children begin organizing around a living parent's estate, seek access to financial records without authorization, and suggest the parent is struggling to manage affairs they are managing well, the trajectory is consistent. They were building a case, however informal, that I was no longer fully capable of handling my own affairs. The goal was either to pressure me into voluntary early transfer or to eventually support a claim of diminished capacity. Both paths led to the same destination, my assets in their hands while I was still alive and watching. Margaret pulled up my existing will and we reviewed it together. Under its current terms, the 3 children would inherit equally after my death. There was nothing preventing me from changing it at any point during my lifetime, as long as I was legally competent, which I clearly was. She then asked me a question I had not yet asked myself. She asked whether I still wanted these 3 specific people to be the beneficiaries of everything I had worked to build. I did not answer immediately. I looked at the ceiling of her office and thought about the jewelry box, the unauthorized calls, the rehearsed conversation at my kitchen table, and the word burden spoken about me in my own home. Then I told her I needed to think carefully. I would call her within the week. I spent 3 days alone with that question. I walked through the properties, each one taking my time. I stood in the building on Callahan Street and remembered the risk I had taken when no one else would. I stood in the Vieira Avenue space and remembered Elena saying she could see what it would become. I stood on the hill and looked at the red roof tiles in the afternoon light. I was not grieving. I was assessing. And what I concluded at the end of those 3 days was that the most honest thing I could do with what I had built was to decide its destination myself, deliberately, and with full awareness of what each choice meant for everyone involved, including me. I called Margaret and told her I wanted to revise the will entirely. I told her I had 3 charitable organizations I wanted to designate as the primary beneficiaries of the estate. I also told her I intended to begin significant donations immediately, transferring substantial liquid assets to those organizations over the following months, so that by the time of my eventual death, the estate would consist primarily of less liquid holdings with certain encumbrances that would make them difficult to convert quickly to cash. Margaret asked if I was certain.
I told her I had never been more certain of anything since the day I signed the deed on the Callahan Street building, alone, at 37 years old, with no one else at the table, and no guarantee of anything ahead.
I also spoke with my financial advisor. He confirmed the donation strategy was legally straightforward, and that assets transferred to registered charitable organizations during my lifetime would be permanently protected from future claims. He noted carefully that once transferred, these assets would remain outside the estate, regardless of any argument afterward. I instructed him to begin the process the following week. I told no one in my family. I continued my daily routine without changing anything visible. I had dinner with Sandra that Thursday and let her talk about her winter holiday plans, without mentioning a word of what I had set in motion. She mentioned the Vieira Avenue property over dessert. I said it was doing very well. That was entirely true. Over the following 4 months, I donated the majority of my liquid assets to 3 foundations. One supporting youth education in low-income communities, one focused on housing for the elderly, and one that had been Elena's favorite charity during her lifetime. Each transfer was documented, witnessed, and registered. Each foundation acknowledged the gifts in their annual reports. I also began the legal process of encumbering the remaining properties with long-term lease agreements that generated income but significantly reduced their attractiveness as immediate assets to inherit. My financial advisor oversaw every step. My lawyer documented every decision. I maintained full legal competence throughout, confirmed in writing by a certified evaluation I requested independently and kept on file. I also restructured my personal finances so that monthly income from the remaining properties covered my living expenses comfortably, leaving me financially independent for the remainder of my life. I was not impoverishing myself. I was ensuring that what I chose to leave my children was precisely what I was willing to leave them, which was substantially less than they had anticipated and encumbered with legal complexities that would require years of professional management to resolve. I was also ensuring that my remaining years would be lived entirely on my own terms, without the awareness of being assessed as a financial asset by people who had decided I was a burden before I had finished being a father. The remaining estate consisted of the 3 properties with long-term lease agreements, several partnership interests with restricted transferability, and the artwork collection whose valuation required specialized expertise. Each element represented real value, but not the kind that could be quickly divided or liquidated. My will now included specific provisions about management timelines and conditions that any beneficiary would be required to meet. If my children wanted what remained, they would have to work for it and demonstrate the patience to wait for it and the seriousness to manage it properly. I considered these conditions entirely appropriate, given the lesson they had been trying to teach me about impatience. I also left a letter, not with the will, but sealed and placed in a safe deposit box, with instructions that it be given to all 3 children simultaneously on the day the will was first read. The letter was not angry. It did not lecture. It was 3 paragraphs long. It explained plainly that I had been present for every conversation they had held in my house during that period. It explained what I had heard and what I had understood. And it explained that my decisions had been made not from bitterness but from clarity, the same clarity that had guided every significant decision I had made across 40 years of building something from nothing. I signed it with my full name, no salutation at all. My children continued their quiet campaign throughout the months I was making my arrangements. Richard called regularly with what he called check-ins, but which were really assessments of my condition. Paul sent articles about estate planning for seniors. Sandra visited monthly, always pleasant, always scanning the shelves and the walls, looking for signs of what was where. None of them knew what was happening. They believed the timeline of their inheritance was simply being delayed by my stubbornness and my continued good health. They did not know the landscape had already been altered beneath their feet, quietly and legally, and with full documentation, while they were busy calculating what they believed they were owed. Richard called on a Friday to say he had located an estate planning specialist he thought we should all meet together. He framed it as a family initiative. He said he wanted everyone on the same page. He suggested a dinner at his house the following week, where we could all sit down together with the specialist present. I told him I thought that was a very good idea, and that I would be happy to come. I did not mention that my lawyer had already filed the revised will, or that the first major donation had cleared the previous Tuesday, or that what the specialist would find when he opened his folder would have almost no resemblance to what my children were expecting him to find. The dinner took place on a Wednesday. Richard had arranged it carefully. A good meal, a comfortable setting, the estate specialist waiting with a presentation prepared. I arrived on time. I sat in the chair they indicated and listened as the specialist began, building his presentation on the assumption that I had not yet made any significant decisions. When he reached the section on donation strategies and their effect on future inheritance, I placed my hand on the table and asked if I might share some information relevant to the discussion. I took a copy of the revised will from my jacket, placed it on the table, and laid beside it the acknowledgment letter from the First Charitable Foundation. The room became very quiet. I explained, in the same measured tone I had always used in business negotiations, what I had done and why. I explained the donations. I explained the encumbrances on the remaining properties. I explained the letter in the safe deposit box. I did not raise my voice. I did not express anger or satisfaction. I explained it the way you explain a completed transaction to a counterparty who needs to understand the current state of the deal. Richard asked whether I understood what this meant for the family. I said I understood it completely. Paul asked whether it could be reversed. I told him charitable transfers made during the lifetime of a competent adult are permanent and fully protected. Sandra looked at her hands. The estate specialist quietly closed his folder. What followed was a period of silence, then anger, then negotiation, then something closer to a reckoning. Richard called me the following day with a long argument about my obligations to my children. I listened and then reminded him of the morning in my living room, the word burden, the rehearsed posture, the calls to my accountant without my authorization. I told him I had not acted impulsively. I had acted after sustained and careful reflection on everything I had observed over many months. I told him I loved my children, and that love was not in question. What was in question was whether love required me to surrender what I had built to people who had already decided I was an obstacle rather than a father. He had no answer for that. My life after that dinner was quieter in some ways and more honest in others. The monthly income from the remaining properties continued to cover my needs comfortably. I traveled for the first time since Elena died to 2 places she had always wanted to visit and that I had promised we would reach eventually. I kept that promise in the way I could still keep it. My children and I did not speak for several months. When contact resumed, it was different in texture. There was less performance in it, less management. Richard called on my birthday without mentioning money or the estate or anything except how I was spending the day. I took that as the beginning of something, not trust restored,
but the possibility of honesty that had not previously existed between us.
The charitable foundations continued their work with the resources I had provided. I attended a ceremony at the Youth Education Foundation where I was recognized as a significant donor. One of the students gave a short speech about what the support had made possible for her family. I sat in a plastic chair in a school gymnasium and listened to her, and thought that this was what I had worked toward across 40 years. Not a transfer of figures from one column to another, but something that actually changed the shape of a person's future. Elena would have understood that immediately. She always understood the real purpose of things before I did. I was glad I had finally caught up with her on this one. What I did was not cruelty, and it was not revenge. It was the exercise of a right that belongs to every person who builds something with their own hands and their own years, the right to decide where that thing goes. I made my decision with full clarity, full legal competence, and full awareness of the consequences. The law permitted it. My conscience supported it. My late wife, I believe, would have approved without hesitation. Before I leave you with this, I want to ask you something directly. If your family had begun treating your life's work as an inheritance they were owed before you had finished living, what would you have done? Would you have given them what they wanted? Or would you have decided, as I did, that the person who builds the table also gets to choose who sits at it? Leave your answer below.